Israel Keyes wasn't the kind of monster you saw coming. He didn't walk around with crazy eyes or wild behavior. He looked like a quiet dude you'd pass in a parking lot and forget 2 seconds later. A regular American handyman with a crew cut, a soft voice, and a polite smile. The kind of guy who'd help you jumpstart your car, fix a loose hinge, hold the door open for you at the grocery store. But underneath that calm, clean, well-behaved surface was something Americans still struggle to understand. A predator with discipline, patience, and a level of cold calculation most serial killers never even get close to. Keyes wasn't driven by rage, obsession, or trauma. He wasn't replaying childhood pain or chasing voices in his head. He killed because he liked it, because it made him feel powerful, because the planning, the long, slow, quiet preparation gave him a thrill nothing else could match. And the worst part? He was good at it. Really good. Israel Keyes grew up in a small, isolated world where rules didn't come from society, just from the people around him. Off the grid, far from cities, far from law enforcement, far from anyone who might have noticed the strange, twisted thoughts growing inside him. As a kid, he learned to hunt, track, and stalk animals in the woods, the kind of skills most people never master in their lifetime. And somewhere along the way, he realized he wasn't interested in hunting animals anymore. He wanted control over something that could scream, something that could beg, something that could fear him. And once that thought planted itself in his mind, it stayed there forever. What made Keyes different wasn't that he killed. Plenty of twisted people do that. What made him terrifying was how he prepared for it. While most killers act impulsively, Israel Keyes built a system, a method, a strategy. He created what he called kill kits, buckets filled with guns, silencers, knives, cash, chemicals, ropes, and everything else he needed to kidnap and murder someone without leaving a trace. Then he buried those kits across the United States. Not in his town, not anywhere close to home. He'd fly to random states, rent a car, drive hundreds of miles, dig up a kit he'd hidden years earlier, find a victim who had nothing to do with him, kill them, and disappear. No connection, no pattern, no motive, no signature. He was a ghost, a hunter with no territory, a killer with no type. He didn't chase women specifically, didn't follow a racial pattern, didn't care about age. He picked victims the way someone picks a restaurant on a road trip. Whatever's there, whatever's easy, whatever works. This is why the FBI still says Israel Keyes may be connected to far more murders than we can prove. He broke the rules every profiler depended on. He didn't leave clues. He didn't revisit scenes. He didn't stalk from home. He didn't brag to anyone. He treated murder like a project, not a passion. And every project started with patience. Imagine a man flying into Chicago, renting a car with a clean ID, buying a camping backpack, and then driving 12 hours to a random lake in New York just to dig up a bucket he'd buried 4 years earlier. Staying in a small motel, drinking a beer, reading a book like any regular traveler, while knowing he planned to kill someone the next day. That's how Keyes operated. Calm, quiet, enjoying the time between steps like it was all part of some twisted ritual. Years before anyone knew his name, Keyes had already decided he'd move in the shadows. He learned how to avoid cameras, how to stay off digital trails, how to keep everything cache-based. He picked remote houses, isolated roads, dark parking lots, locations where no one would hear a scream. He traveled under the radar like a man determined to never be found. He once robbed a bank in a small town just to get money for future murders, then walked away like it was just another part of his road trip. Every detail was calculated.
He never used phones linked to his identity, never brought his own weapons, never struck close to home. He forced the FBI into a nightmare. A killer with no pattern is a killer you can't catch. For years, Keyes lived a double life that fooled everyone around him. In public, he was a father, a boyfriend, a construction worker, a man who built fences and sheds for neighbors and cracked small jokes while he worked. He went fishing with his daughter. He drank at barbecue parties. He laughed easily, listened quietly, and rarely raised his voice. To everyone around him, he seemed like the definition of harmless. But in the dark, Keyes was rehearsing. Every trip, every hotel, every rental car, every buried kit, the way he chose his victims, the way he moved their bodies, even the way he cleaned up afterwards. He treated murder like a craft, a skill he wanted to master. And the scariest truth is that he did. The FBI believes Keyes might have murdered people across the entire country: Washington, Oregon, Vermont, Texas, Arizona, Wyoming, New York, maybe more. He once admitted he'd lose count. That's how casual killing became for him. But Keyes' downfall didn't start with a victim. It started with a mistake, a moment of sloppiness, a crack in the calm, perfect mask he'd spent years maintaining, a kidnapping that didn't go the way he planned, a victim whose disappearance caused more noise than he expected, a slip that made federal investigators finally catch a trail, thin at first, but enough to pull him out of the shadows, enough to turn the ghost into a man with a face, a name, and a dark history no one around him ever suspected. The story of Israel Keyes isn't just about murder. It's about a man who built his life around hiding in plain sight. A man who studied the FBI, studied other killers, and decided he'd be better than all of them. A man who treated death like a hobby, and the entire country like his hunting ground. And the one part of this story leads us to the moment where the ghost made the first mistake of his life, the moment everything began to unravel. Keyes' first real mistake began the night he targeted Samantha Koenig in Anchorage, Alaska. It wasn't supposed to be complicated. He had done this kind of thing for years across different states. But this time, everything he normally avoided happened all at once. Samantha wasn't in a remote cabin or an empty parking lot or a quiet rural road. She was working at a coffee stand with cameras around it, the kind of setup he usually stayed miles away from. But for some reason, maybe impatience, maybe boredom, maybe arrogance, he went for it. He walked up to the small kiosk wearing a mask, pretending to rob the place. Samantha, confused and scared, tried to cooperate. Keyes forced his way inside, tied her up, and made her leave with him. And right there, before they even left the area, one camera caught something Keyes hated more than anything: evidence of him moving with a victim. That one moment cracked the illusion he'd kept for so long.
After taking Samantha, Keyes brought her to his home, a place he had always kept separate from his crimes. But again, this wasn't his usual behavior. Bringing a victim to his own property was reckless. He knew that. He spent years avoiding that. But on this night, he broke his own rule. His daughter was sleeping in the house, his girlfriend was inside, and he still carried out the crime. He had the TV on, the lights low, the cold Alaskan night outside the walls, and inside that quiet home, he committed the act that would eventually expose him. It wasn't fast, it wasn't clean, it wasn't controlled the way he liked. And afterward, Keyes tried to act normal again, waking up, getting breakfast, acting like nothing happened. But the boldness of what he'd done created a trail he couldn't erase. To make things worse, Keyes didn't disappear after the crime the way he normally would. Instead, he stayed involved. He staged a ransom. He used Samantha's phone to send a text to make it look like she was still alive. He printed a ransom note using a postcard and old newspaper letters. He left the note in a park. He made Samantha's body appear alive in a photograph by sewing her eyelids and positioning her. And worst of all, he used her debit card. That single action was the nail in the coffin. Keyes was obsessed with staying untraceable, yet here he was leaving a digital trail from Alaska all the way across multiple states. He couldn't resist using the card to pull money out. Every withdrawal pinged a location. Every location pulled the FBI closer. Keyes left Alaska thinking he was in the clear, but federal agents were already tracking the card. They analyzed the ATM footage, even though he covered his face, and they watched the direction the transactions were moving, one state, then another, then another. Finally, in Texas, his pattern slipped. He was driving a rental car, using the same ATM method, wearing similar clothing, and the FBI saw enough. Texas Highway Patrol pulled him over at night. The officer didn't know who he was stopping, just a quiet man driving a white rental car. But inside that car was the kidnapping victim's debit card, her phone, rolled-up cash, and the exact items investigators were looking for. Keyes realized right there, sitting on the side of the road, that everything he built, years of planning, traveling, killing like a ghost, was collapsing because of a handful of mistakes he never should have made. Once arrested, Keyes didn't panic, he didn't cry, he didn't rage. He behaved exactly the way he always behaved, calm, polite, almost friendly. He answered questions like he was discussing a home repair project. He smiled at investigators. He leaned back in his chair. His voice barely changed. For the FBI, it was unsettling to sit across from someone who could talk about murder with the same tone someone uses to talk about their grocery list. But Keyes wasn't confessing because he felt guilty. He wasn't breaking down. He was calculating. He wanted control. He wanted to decide what the FBI knew and what they didn't. He teased them with hints. He told them he traveled a lot. He suggested they'd need to check multiple states. He said he had a method. When investigators asked how many victims there were, he didn't answer. He smirked. He said, less than a dozen. But even that sounded like a lie. The more the FBI pressed, the more Keyes revealed, but always carefully. He admitted to burying kill kits years before he ever used them. He described flying into one airport and renting a car and driving across the country. He detailed murders that happened thousands of miles from Alaska. He talked about couples he attacked. He talked about houses he broke into. He talked about staying in campgrounds and watching strangers until he found the right moment. But he never showed emotion, not even once. No guilt, no anger, no fear. When investigators listened to him, they weren't hearing a man describing crimes. They were hearing a man describing a hobby. And that coldness made them realize something terrifying. They were only getting a small percentage of the truth. Keyes wanted one thing from the FBI: privacy. He didn't want his daughter to read about him in the news. He didn't want his name exposed until he was done talking. He wanted control over his own story. He wanted to manage the timing. He wanted to choose the order of information. Even after being caught, he still acted like he was in command. He tried negotiating his confessions like business deals. And the FBI went along with it because they needed answers. Every clue he gave them opened another door. Every door led to another unsolved case. But the deeper they went, the more they realized Keyes was operating on a level no one expected. The interviews became a game. Keyes spoke softly, deliberately, like someone who enjoyed watching people try to understand him. He corrected investigators when they got details wrong. He joked sometimes. He rolled his eyes when they asked basic questions. And slowly, painfully, they started to figure out how wide his hunting ground really was. He admitted to a double murder in Vermont. He talked about a house fire that wasn't an accident. He hinted at bodies hidden in lakes, woods, and remote places where no one would ever think to search. The United States map on the wall behind the agents started looking less like a country and more like a collection of crime scenes.
But while Keyes played games with the FBI, investigators noticed something else. His patience was fading. The calm, controlled predator was getting restless. He didn't like being trapped in a cell. He didn't like the idea of waiting months or years for trial. His quiet, steady energy started to feel sharper, shorter, more unpredictable. And as he talked, investigators realized the one thing Keyes couldn't stand was losing control. When the FBI told him some details would eventually reach the media, Keyes' tone shifted. For the first time, he showed frustration. He didn't want the world defining him. He wanted to define himself. And that desire to be the one in charge of the story would lead directly to the ending he chose.
Keyes never planned on letting the justice system decide his fate. Never planned on sitting through a trial where prosecutors described him as something he didn't think he was. He wasn't insane. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't the kind of killer who wrote letters to newspapers or demanded attention. He was a man who lived in the shadows and wanted to leave the same way. And as the investigation pushed deeper, as the FBI connected more dots, and as Keyes lost more power, he made a decision that cut the story off before the world could hear the full truth. Keyes realized the walls were closing in faster than he expected. The FBI wasn't stopping. Every interview added pressure. Every clue he gave them led to another question he didn't want to answer. And every day he sat in that cell, he lost more of the control he built his life around. The thing he feared most wasn't prison, it was exposure. He didn't want reporters digging into his past, psychologists labeling him, strangers analyzing him. He didn't want his daughter growing up with his name plastered across the internet. He wanted silence. He wanted darkness. He wanted an ending he controlled, not one handed to him by a judge or jury. So he started planning the way he always planned, quietly, patiently, calculating every detail. He studied the jail routines. He observed guard patterns. He noted when the lights dimmed, when footsteps faded, when the hallways fell still. He waited for a night where everything lined up, and inside that small, cold cell, the same mind that designed kill kits and mapped out murders across the country now focused on one final task: disappearing before anyone forced him to say more. While the FBI kept preparing to dig deeper, Keyes prepared to shut the door forever. He sharpened a piece of metal. He hit it. He tested how long it would take for guards to check on him. He made small cuts on his skin in advance so he could control the bleeding pattern later. Every step had to be perfect, silent, final. The FBI never predicted how soon he would act. They still believed they had time. They thought he'd keep talking, revealing case by case, breadcrumb by breadcrumb. But Keyes was done. He'd reached his limit. The moment investigators mentioned the possibility of more information being made public, information he didn't get to control, something in him snapped. Not emotionally, but strategically. He wasn't going to let anyone else dictate his narrative. He wasn't going to let the world categorize him. His crimes had always been his private world, something only he understood. And the idea of losing that privacy felt worse to him than death. One night, when the jail went quiet and the guards moved into their usual rotation, Keyes made his move. He'd written a long, disturbing note full of strange drawings, cryptic lines, and rambling thoughts that revealed nothing useful about his crimes. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an explanation. It was a final act of misdirection, a way to waste investigators' time and leave them with more questions than answers. Then he took the metal blade he'd hidden, cut deeply into his wrists and arms, and let the blood spill. He tried to make it fast, but he also tried to make it clean. No noise, no chaos, no chance for anyone to stop him. He wanted his exit to be just like his crimes, silent. By the time guards found him, it was over. Israel Keyes ended his life before sunrise. No dramatic scene, no goodbye message, no final interview. Just a man lying in a cell, his control restored in the only way he believed was left. And the worst part for investigators wasn't the shock of finding him dead. It was the sudden realization that he took the truth with him. All the unfinished questions, the unknown victims, the missing bodies, the untraced kill kits, everything vanished with him in that moment. The only person who truly knew the full scope of his crimes was gone. The FBI was left with fragments, notes, half-confessions, hints, suspicious timelines, cases that matched pieces of his travel history but had no proof. They opened homicide investigations in multiple states. They revisited old missing person files. They searched lakes, forests, and rural roads based on vague comments he made. But for every answer they found, 10 more questions popped up. Keyes had built his entire life around staying unconnected to his crimes, and even in death, he kept that mastery intact. His kill kits, buried in remote places, may still be out there. His victims, hidden far from where anyone would think to look, may never be recovered. And the total number of lives he ended will probably never be known. To this day, investigators believe Israel Keyes could be one of the most dangerous and prolific serial killers in American history, not because of the number of victims officially linked to him, but because of the number that logically connect to his movements. He traveled constantly with no pattern, no motive, no signature. He hopped state lines the way most people run errands. He stored weapons and supplies in places he knew he might return to years later. He selected victims who had no ties to him, no connections, no predictable traits. He designed his crimes to be impossible to solve, and in most cases, they were. Even his death felt like part of that design, a final way to make sure the truth stayed buried with him. Israel Keyes left behind a blueprint for how a modern serial killer could operate without being caught. Travel far, plan in advance, avoid patterns, avoid emotional choices, use cash, pick random victims, destroy evidence immediately, and never strike close to home. It was a method so efficient and so cold that the FBI had to rethink parts of how they profile certain types of killers. And even with all their resources, all their interviews, all their surveillance, they still reached the end of the investigation with more uncertainty than clarity. Keyes didn't just commit crimes, he engineered them. In the years since his death, the fear around his case hasn't faded. Americans still talk about him because he represents something deeply unsettling. A killer who didn't behave like a killer. No loud red flags, no messy outbursts, no obvious motive. Just a man who blended in perfectly and hunted when he felt like it. Someone who viewed the entire country as a playground for murder. Someone who killed not for revenge, not for obsession, not for attention, but for the pure, cold thrill of controlling another person's fate. And the worst part? There could be more people like him out there. People who learned from him, people who plan better, travel smarter, and stay invisible longer. Keyes may be gone, but the shadow he cast still lingers in every unsolved disappearance that matches his timeline. Every cold case near the places he traveled. Every missing person report that came from a quiet town he passed through. Investigators still revisit old files, still connect dots, still search. But some cases will never be solved. Some victims will never be found. And that's exactly how Keyes wanted it. He left the world the same way he moved through it, silent, calculated, and without ever giving anyone the full truth. And that is the story of Israel Keyes, the ghost serial killer who treated murder like a craft, who traveled the country without leaving a trace, who fooled everyone around him, who played the FBI like a game, and who ended his own life to make sure the real number of victims died with him. As long as there are unsolved cases that match his pattern, his shadow will never fully disappear. You've been watching Universal Crime, where the truth is always darker than the rumors. If you want more real cases, more deep dives, and more stories that keep you thinking long after the video ends, hit subscribe and stay with us. Until the next case, stay sharp, stay aware, and never forget, evil hides in plain sight.